The jungle never slept. That was the first thing Mara learned when the Veth came. Before, the canopy at night had been alive with sound, the slow drip of moisture from leaf to leaf, the distant percussion of frogs, the soft exhalations of a world that breathed without asking permission. She had grown up listening to it from the hammock outside her grandmother's house in the deep interior, where the river had no name on any map, and the nearest town was 3 days of walking through heat that tasted like wet iron. She knew the jungle's silence the way she knew her own heartbeat, by its absence, by what it meant when it stopped. It stopped the night the Veth arrived in their ships. They came down like burning seeds, a dozen vessels splitting the sky above the canopy in a single coordinated bloom. Not crashing, not failing. Controlled descent, precise and unhurried, the way a boot heel descends before it presses down. Mara had been standing in the doorway of the research station with a tin mug of black coffee going cold in her hand, watching the stars for no reason she could name except that the frogs had stopped 20 minutes earlier. When the first light punched through the clouds, she didn't run. She just stood there, the coffee getting colder, and watched. There was something in her that had always been slower than fear. She'd been told this was a defect. She'd learned over the following years that it was the only reason she was still alive. The Veth were not conquerors in any sense the old stories had prepared her for. They didn't want the cities. They didn't make speeches or issue ultimatums through captured radio stations. They set down in the most remote places on the planet, the deep Amazon, the high Congo, the Siberian taiga, the interior of Borneo, and they built structures and they watched. That was the word everyone eventually settled on. They watched. Their suits were the first thing most people saw. Articulated carapaces of a material that bent light around it in ways that made the eye slide off. Each suit standing almost 3 meters tall, each one carrying on its shoulders a sensor array that could smell the difference between a mammal and a reptile from 400 meters away. They moved with the terrible patience of something that had learned to wait across geological time. No one knew what they wanted. The linguists and xenobiologists and military analysts produced reports that contradicted one another in every particular except one. The Veth were cataloging every species, every specimen, every nest and burrow and den and hive. They moved through the world's wild places like archivists, methodical and unhurried, and where they walked the animals fled and did not come back. Mara had been a field primatologist. She had spent 6 years at the station studying a group of Muriqui monkeys in the river basin, 7 adults, 3 juveniles, and 2 infants whose names she had given against all professional recommendation, because she was who she was, and the recommendations of the discipline had never quite held her. The adults were Katarina, Henrique, Luz, and 4 others. The juveniles were Doys and Traers because she had run out of inspiration by then. The infants were Paquina and Gordo, which were not their real names but the names she used when no one was listening, which was most of the time. When the Veth came to the basin, Mara did not evacuate. Everyone else did. The other researchers, the IBAMA staff, the seasonal workers, the journalist from Sao Paulo who had been there writing a feature on sustainable development, and who drove out on the first day in a truck so overloaded with equipment it nearly rolled twice on the dirt road. Mara helped him load the truck. She shook his hand. She said she'd be right behind him. She was not right behind him. She went back inside and sat in the dark for a while and listened to the sounds changing. The Veth established their first cataloging node 3 kilometers southeast of the station within 48 hours of landing. She watched them build it from the ridge with binoculars, a structure of their own material, roughly conical, studded with equipment she couldn't identify. 4 suited figures moving around it with the economy of long-practiced routine. She watched for 6 hours. None of them looked in her direction. She went home and ate rice and beans from a can and went to sleep. In the morning, the Muriquis were still in their trees. That was the thing nobody had planned for. The animals didn't all flee. Some did: the deer, the tapir, the smaller mammals that had always lived on the edge of flight. But the primates, the territorial ones, the ones with something like social memory, they stayed. They watched the Veth the way the Veth watched them, from a cautious distance, neither approaching nor retreating, as if waiting to learn the rules of this new and enormous thing that had appeared in their world. Mara recognized this behavior. She had described it in papers. She called it assessment suspension, the period before an animal commits to a behavioral response when it is still gathering data. It was what she was doing herself. She began keeping a log. Day 1. No contact between Veth units and local fauna. Muriqui group observed at standard territory boundary. No unusual vocalizations. Day 4. Veth survey team passed within 200 meters of Muriqui sleeping trees. Group went silent for approximately 40 minutes. No dispersal. Day 11. First contact. A juvenile dois descended to a low branch approximately 15 meters above a Veth unit that had stopped beneath it. The unit did not move for 22 minutes. Dois returned to the canopy without incident. Day 19. Something she hadn't anticipated. Pequina, the younger infant, had been sick for several days, a respiratory infection of the kind that sometimes moved through the group in the wet season. By day 18, the infant was struggling to hold onto Katarina, her mother, during movement. Mara had been watching through the scope, wondering whether she should intervene, knowing that intervention was complicated now in ways it had never been before. On the morning of day 19, a Veth unit approached the group's resting cluster. Mara had her hand on the rifle she'd found in the storage shed. It had belonged to the station's previous director, who had been afraid of jaguars, and it was old and probably useless against whatever the Veth suits were made of, but it was what she had. The unit stopped. It extended a limb that unfolded into something like a scanner. It swept the scanner across the group slowly, pausing on each individual. When it reached Pequina, it paused for a long time. Then it withdrew the scanner, folded the limb away, and stood there for another 11 minutes without moving. Then it walked away. That night Mara lay in her hammock and listened to the jungle relearning itself around the Veth presence and thought about what she had seen. The unit had scanned Pequina and found something, what? An anomaly, an irregularity in its data. A sick animal was not part of the catalog they were building, or it was, but it required special notation. Or the sick animal was tagged for something. She didn't know. She didn't sleep much. On day 23, she made a decision that she later described to anyone who would listen as the most professionally indefensible thing she had ever done, which was saying something because she had a long professional record and a gift for indefensibility. She moved into the Muriqui's sleeping grove. It was not a strategic decision in any military sense. It was not even a fully conscious one. What happened was this. She had been watching the group's sleeping cluster in the evening through the scope when she saw a second Veth unit approach the grove from the north. Different from the usual survey unit, a larger model she hadn't seen before, with additional equipment mounted on its shoulders and a movement that was somehow more deliberate, more purposeful than the cataloging units. It moved toward the sleeping trees. Katarina was already up there with Pequina, whose breathing had gotten worse. Henrique and Luz were 3 trees over. The others were scattered through the canopy. Mara put down the scope. She picked up the rifle. She walked down the ridge in the dark. She got there before the Veth unit did. She sat down at the base of the largest sleeping tree, in the root hollows, with her back against the bark, and the rifle across her knees and her feet bare, because she'd come down in a hurry and forgotten her boots. She was wearing the worn cotton pajama set she'd been sleeping in since the evacuation, a faded green top with a small tear at the shoulder, and loose pants with a drawstring she had to retie every morning. She smelled like wood smoke and insect repellent, and the particular human smell of someone who has been living without hot water for 3 weeks. Above her, in the darkness of the canopy, Katarina shifted and settled, and there was the small breathy sound of Pequina finding her mother's warmth. The Veth unit came into the clearing. It stopped when its sensors found her. She didn't move. The unit was close enough that she could hear the sound it made, not mechanical exactly, more like the sound of something breathing through a medium that was not air, a low cycling hiss that had rhythm to it. Up close the suit was even less comprehensible than through the scope. The surface was doing something in the low light, textures moving through it that weren't quite reflections, and the visual center of the unit, the place where a face should have been, was a smooth curved plane that told her nothing. Its height made her feel like a child. She looked up at it without expression. It stood there. The sensor array on its shoulders was moving, cycling through orientations. It was reading her. Mara said, very quietly so as not to disturb the animals above her, "I know you can't understand me, but you're going to hear me anyway." She didn't say anything else for a while. The unit didn't move. Above them both, the canopy settled. "That infant up there has a respiratory infection. Her immune system is doing the work it's supposed to do, and she needs warmth and her mother in about 5 more days and she'll be fine. I've seen this before. I know this group." She paused. "I'm not moving." The unit remained where it was. She became aware of something she hadn't noticed at first, that there were 2 more units at the edge of the clearing, visible now as the sensor array on the primary unit threw a little ambient light. They were hanging back, not advancing. She wasn't sure what that meant. She filed it. "You've been cataloging everything here," she said. "I've watched you do it, methodical, patient. I can respect that. But this group has been here for 30 years. There are individuals up there who were born in this grove. Their mothers were born here. Their social structure, their food routes, their communication patterns, they're not numbers in a scan. They're a community with a history." She shifted the rifle slightly on her knees, not pointing it at anything, just moving it. "I'm not going to shoot you with this. I'm aware it probably wouldn't do much. I'm holding it because it's what I have, and I'm a primate, and primates hold things when they're scared." The unit moved. Not toward her, it turned its sensor array to the canopy, slowly, systematically, the way it had been turning sensors on everything in the basin for weeks. Scanning. But it did not advance. It stood at the edge of the clearing and conducted its scan from there. Then it withdrew. All 3 units withdrew, silent and unhurried, back into the trees. Mara sat at the base of the sleeping tree until dawn. She didn't sleep. She listened to Katarina shift above her and to Pequena's breathing, labored, unsteady, but there, present, continuing. In the morning she went back to the station, put on her boots, made coffee, and wrote in the log, "Day 23. Behavioral trial inconclusive. Will repeat if necessary." She repeated it for the next 11 days. On the 2nd night, she brought a blanket. On the 4th, she brought the camp chair with the broken arm that she'd been meaning to throw away for 2 years. She brought her notebooks and her headlamp with the red filter, and she sat in the root hollows and wrote up her observations and fell asleep twice without meaning to, and woke up both times to the sound of the unit, the same large unit. She was certain of that now, standing at the edge of the clearing. It was always the same unit. She started calling it the Watcher, which was ironic, and she knew it. It came every night between the 2nd and 3rd hour of darkness. It stood at the clearing edge. Its sensor array moved across the sleeping cluster above her. It did not advance past the point where she sat. On the 6th night she started talking more. She told it about the Muriqui social structure, the unusual degree of male cooperation, the low aggression relative to other primate species, the long-term memory studies she'd been running with photo identification. She told it about Katarina's previous infant, who had been stillborn 3 seasons ago and whom Katarina had carried for 4 days before releasing. She told it about Henrique's habit of posting himself on the highest available branch whenever a harpy eagle was reported in the area, and calling until the rest of the group acknowledged him. She told it about Luz, who had what Mara privately theorized was an unusual degree of spatial memory, and who consistently navigated the fastest routes between food sources even on novel paths. She didn't know if it understood anything. She talked anyway. The talking was not only for the watcher, it was for herself, the discipline of narration, of turning raw observation into structured meaning, which was the only kind of thinking she knew how to do all the way through. When she narrated, she didn't panic. When she didn't narrate, she sometimes did. On the 8th night, Pequena's breathing was easier. On the 10th night, Katarina climbed down 4 meters from the sleeping cluster and sat on a branch directly above Mara's camp chair. She sat there for perhaps 30 minutes, not looking at Mara. Muriquis rarely made direct eye contact. They found it destabilizing but present, proximate. The watcher stood at the clearing edge the way it always stood, and Mara sat below the monkey, and the monkey sat above the woman, and the alien stood at the threshold, and none of them moved for a long time. Mara wrote in the log, "Something is happening that I don't have the vocabulary for yet. We'll try to develop it." On the 11th night, the watcher crossed the clearing. It didn't come all the way to her. It stopped about 4 meters out, which put it closer than it had ever been, and its sensor array went into a different mode: slower rotations, deeper dwell on individual subjects. It was reading the monkeys from closer range. But it also stopped its sensor array on Mara for a long time, longer than it had before, and she had the unscientific but visceral impression of being understood by something that didn't share a single sensory modality with her, and was doing the work of translation anyway. She said, "You're trying to figure out what I am in relation to them." The unit's sensor array stopped moving entirely. "I'm not their mother. I'm not their keeper. They don't belong to me and I don't belong to them. We're two species who have been occupying the same territory long enough to have developed something like," she paused, "long enough to matter to each other. That's the best I can do." Above her in the sleeping cluster, Gordo made the small grunt bark that meant he'd shifted in his sleep and was settling again. Katarina answered it, a soft, low vocalization. Not alarm, just presence, just "I'm here," the same sound, Mara thought, in every language. The watcher stood there for another few minutes. Then it went back to the clearing edge. Then it left. It didn't come back the next night. Or the night after. On the 3rd morning after its last visit, Mara found something at the base of the sleeping tree. It was placed in the root hollow where she had been sitting, placed there, not fallen there, she was certain. It was small, roughly the size of a fist, made of the Veth's material. It had the same unsettling light behavior as the suits, surfaces doing something that wasn't quite a reflection. She turned it over. On one face, there was a pattern she had no reference for, a series of forms that were neither geometric nor organic, a notation in some system she had no training to read. She took it back to the station and photographed it from every angle and emailed the images to the xenolinguistics team at INPA that she had been in intermittent contact with by satellite phone, which still worked because the Veth seemed indifferent to human communications infrastructure. They wrote back in 3 hours. "We have no idea, but please send better photos." She sent better photos. They wrote back, "We still have no idea, but it might be a record, like a notation in a catalog. A classification mark." She sat with that for a while. Then she opened the log and wrote, "Day 35. Received what may be a cataloging notation from the watcher. Hypothesis, we have been classified. The question is as what?" She thought about that for a long time. She thought about what the Veth were doing here, the comprehensive systematic cataloging of the world's wild places, the careful non-intervention, the approach and withdrawal, the way they had come to the basin and mapped everything in it and had, apparently, added something to their catalog that they hadn't had before. She thought about the 11th night and the watcher crossing the clearing. She thought about what crosses a clearing. Not a predator. A predator goes where it intends to go regardless of what's in the way. Not prey. Prey doesn't come toward you. Something that is deciding whether you are a threat. Something that is deciding whether you are territory. Something that is deciding what category to put you in. She picked up the small carved object and held it in her palm and felt the weight of it, which was more than she expected, and thought, "You came here to catalog what lived in this place. You found the species you expected. And then you found me, one of the world's most invasive and destructive animals, sitting in the dirt in her pajamas, not threatening anything, talking to primates in the dark. And you had to make a new category." She put the object on the shelf next to her notebooks. On day 38, 3 things happened. First, Pequina's respiratory infection resolved completely. She was ranging independently for the first time in 2 weeks, following Katarina at a distance that suggested growing confidence rather than dependency. Mara documented this in the log with a level of professional detachment that didn't quite cover the other thing she was feeling, which was uncomplicated relief. Second, the satellite phone rang. It was a man named Drummond from something that called itself the Coordinação Nacional de Resposta, the national coordination body that had formed in the 2nd month of the Veth presence, and that spent most of its time trying to figure out if the Veth were a threat, and if so to what, and in what order. Drummond had a clipped official voice, and he spoke with the particular precision of someone who had learned that precision was how you sounded credible when you had no idea what you were talking about. He told Mara that her situation had come to the attention of the coordination body. He said he wanted to talk about her observations. She told him she was in the middle of something. He said this was important. She said so was what she was doing. He said the government needed. She hung up. She would call him back in a week. She had learned, in the years of field work, that most things that called themselves urgent could wait 7 days without permanent damage, and that most things that genuinely couldn't wait would find her themselves without needing to be called back. Third, and this was the thing she turned over in her mind for the rest of the day and through that night and into the following morning, she found fresh tracks in the soft ground near the station. Veth tracks, the characteristic tri-lobed print of the suit's support structures, which she had been documenting since week 1. But these were different. They came from the northeast, which was the direction away from the cataloging node and away from the basin, which was also away from any habitat she'd seen the Veth units moving through in her weeks of observation. They came to within 40 meters of the station door. Then they stopped, just stopped mid-track as if the unit had been there and then simply was not. She walked the perimeter, no retreat path, no continuation. Just arrival and absence. She went inside and drank 2 cups of coffee and thought about this carefully. The cataloging units didn't come near the station. They had been operating in the basin since day 1 and the station had no significance to them. It was a human structure, not part of the ecosystem they were mapping, and they moved past it the way surveyors move past a fence post. But these tracks were from something that had specifically come to the station, specifically come to where she was. She looked at the small carved object on the shelf. She thought, "You classified me. The question is whether the classification has consequences." She began, in a quiet and methodical way, to think about what she would do if the answer was yes. The thing about field work was that it taught you how to operate on limited information for extended periods without freezing. You learned to build working models of behavior with insufficient data, to make predictions that were explicitly provisional, to act on your best current understanding while keeping the other hand free to revise. She had been doing this with the Muraquis for 6 years. She had been doing it with the Veth for 38 days. The skills transferred in ways she hadn't anticipated and was now grateful for. She thought, if I were classifying something I'd encountered in a new territory, and I found it didn't fit my existing categories, the next step would be to gather more data, which means the unit that came to the station wasn't a threat assessment. It was a second scan, a verification pass, which meant she was in a category that required verification, which was different from being in a category that required neutralization. That was the important distinction. She had made it 38 days by being something they hadn't seen before, a human who stayed, who sat with the animals without predating them, who occupied a threshold position that didn't fit their catalog. She had made it by being confusing. Being confusing was, she now understood, her primary defense. It was possibly her only one. She needed to stay confusing. Drummond called back on day 41. This time she answered. He had, in the intervening days, clearly done some research. He knew about her work. He knew about the Muriquis. He knew, with a specificity that told her the satellite phone was not as private as she'd assumed, about the nightly vigils. He wanted to know, with a studied casualness that didn't quite land, what she thought the Veth were doing. She told him what she thought. She told him about the cataloging, the systematic non-intervention, the apparent interest in intact ecosystems and their inhabitants, the behavioral data she'd been collecting. She told him about the Watcher and the clearing and the carved object. She did not tell him about the tracks near the station. She wasn't sure why she held that back. Something about not yet knowing what it meant. Drummond was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We've had reports from other sites. Scientists who stayed in place in the Pantanal, in the Congo Basin, in northern Borneo. Most of them had similar experiences to yours. Some of them had different ones." "Different how?" Another pause. "We think there are multiple categories. The Veth aren't treating all the sites the same way. Some of them they're documenting and moving on. Some of them, the ones where the ecosystems are more degraded, where there's more human impact, those they seem to be classifying differently. We're not sure what differently means yet. The researchers there are no longer responding to contact." Myra looked at the shelf, at the carved object. "Are they dead?" "We don't know. The satellites show no signs of we don't know." She thanked him for the information. She said she'd be in touch. She hung up. She sat for a long time in the camp chair with the broken arm. The basin was an anomaly by any measure. 6 years of non-extractive research, minimal infrastructure, active preservation of habitat. The Muriquis were a healthy group in a functioning ecosystem, with a human presence that had been, on balance, more protective than damaging. The Veth had come here and found something they apparently found worth cataloging with care. She thought about the sites where the ecosystems were degraded, where the human impact was heavy, where the researchers were no longer responding. She thought about what you do with a specimen that doesn't fit your preservation criteria. She looked out the window at the trees. She thought, "I have to make sure they keep finding us interesting." She called Drummond back. She said, "I need you to help me do something." He said, "What?" She said, "I need you to find me every researcher, every local guide, every community member who stayed in place in an intact habitat site and is still in contact. I need to know what they've been doing, what's working." He was quiet. She said, "And I need you to do it quietly, not through the coordination body's main channels, just the individuals, the people who stayed." "What are you planning?" She thought about Katarina sitting above her on the branch in the dark, not looking at her but there, present, proximate. "I'm planning to be as confusing as possible," she said, "at scale." What followed was 2 months of work that Mara had no adequate framework for, and so built one as she went. The people Drummond found for her were like her in the ways that mattered, not in background or training or temperament, but in the decision they had made, the specific quality of stubbornness that had kept them in place when everyone else left. There was Adriano, a Ribeirão fisherman from the lower Tapajos who had stayed on his family's land, because leaving was not a concept his family had ever successfully executed, and he saw no reason to start. There was Dr. Nkemdiram from the University of Lagos, a botanist who had been tracking a rare epiphyte population in the Niger Delta, and who had developed, over 7 weeks of close Veth observation, a detailed behavioral taxonomy that she shared with Mara in a series of satellite messages that were models of scientific precision, and also, between the data, quietly terrified. There was a woman named Lin from the Mekong Delta who kept bees, and had been keeping bees through flood and drought and bureaucracy for 40 years, and who had stayed because her bees were healthy, and she wasn't going to leave her bees. There was a Siberian ornithologist named Volkov whose communications arrived in Russian, and then in a translation that had clearly passed through several automatic systems before reaching Mara, giving his observations a dreamlike quality that she had initially thought was error and later understood was actually just Volkov. They compared notes, they shared what was working. What was working, it turned out, was a version of what Mara had been doing: presence without predation, relationship without ownership, occupation of the threshold between human and wild. The Veth were not ignoring these people. They were watching them with the same methodical attention they gave to the rest of the ecosystems, and at each of these sites, the cataloging had continued past the point where it had stopped at the damaged sites. At the damaged sites, the units had completed their scan and moved on. Here, they kept coming back. They were still trying to figure out what to put in the notation. Mara wrote to the group, "I think that's what we need to be. Indefinitely unclassifiable. Not because we're hiding from them, but because we're genuinely something they haven't encountered. Something at the edge of their taxonomy." Adriano, whose communications were brief and always practical, wrote back, "My grandfather used to say the jungle doesn't know what to do with the man who doesn't take more than he needs. Maybe that is what this is." She printed that out and put it on the wall next to the carved object. On day 93, the Watcher came back. It came in the middle of the afternoon, which was unprecedented. It had always come at night. She was sitting outside the station doing data entry when she saw it emerge from the tree line 200 meters south, and the thing that struck her first was that it was alone. The cataloging teams always moved in at least pairs. This unit was by itself, and it was moving toward her directly, not in the sweeping survey pattern she had mapped over 3 months of observation, but straight, purposeful, the trajectory of something that knows where it's going. She put down the notebook. She sat still. It stopped 10 meters from her, closer than it had ever been. The sensor array was still, not scanning, not sweeping, just aimed at her. She looked up at it. "You came in the daytime," she said. "That's different." The unit extended a limb. Not the scanner limb, a different one, something she hadn't seen before, extending from the lower left of the suit's torso structure. It held out something small. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she stood up. She walked to the unit. She took the small object from the extended limb. It was similar to the first carved piece, the same material, the same unsettling light behavior. But it was larger, and the pattern on it was more complex: multiple notations, overlapping, a denser text in whatever system they used. She turned it over. On one face, set apart from the rest, was a notation she recognized. Not the notation itself, which she couldn't read, but its position and its isolation, which matched exactly the position and isolation of the single notation on the first object. The same classification mark, but surrounded now by more context. She looked up at the unit. "You gave me more information about what I am." The sensor array moved once, a single deliberate rotation, and came back to her. She stood there holding the object and looking up at something 3 meters tall that had no face and no voice and no common history with her species, and she felt, in the place below language where the things that matter actually live, something she recognized but couldn't name. The recognition of being seen. Not understood. She wasn't claiming that. She was a scientist. She knew the difference between data and meaning. But seen, registered, placed in a catalog that would persist past this moment, past this basin, past whatever happened next. She said, "What happens now?" The unit stood there. She said, "I have a group up there." She tilted her head toward the canopy. "That has been here longer than I have. If you're going to make decisions about this place, I need you to understand that they were here first. I was a guest. The kind of guest who stayed too long and started caring too much, but a guest. She held the object out toward it, not offering it back, just holding it between them. I'm not asking you to see them the way I see them. I know you can't. I'm asking you to factor in that someone was here who did. The unit remained still for a long moment. Then it turned, slowly, deliberately, and it looked, if that was the word, if looking was something it did, toward the trees, toward the canopy where the Muriquis were in their midday rest. The sensor array moved through its full range and held, pointed up into the green dark. It stood there for 11 minutes, Mara counted. Then it withdrew. She stood with the carved object in her hand and watched it go and thought about what she had not said, which was everything she didn't know. What would happen to the damaged sites and the people who had been lost contact with? What the Veth wanted at the scale she couldn't see from the root hollow of a sleeping tree in one river basin in one country on one planet. What it meant to be catalogued by something that measured time in ways she couldn't calculate. She thought, you can only work in the scale you have. She went back to her chair. She sat down. She picked up the notebook and opened it to the next blank page. She wrote Day 93. Second direct contact with the Watcher. Received a second notation object more complex than the first. Current hypothesis. We have been placed in a category that requires ongoing observation rather than terminal assessment. This may mean nothing at scale. At the scale of this basin, it means everything. She put the pen down. Above her in the canopy, Gordo made the small bark that meant he'd woken up and was looking for his mother. A moment later, from 20 meters away, Katarina answered. Mara listened to that exchange, the call, the answer, the brief silence that was also communication, and felt something that she would describe later, to the people who asked her to describe it, as the particular human feeling of being in the right place. Not a safe place. Not a comfortable place. Not a place with clear outcomes or guaranteed futures. Just the right one, arrived at by the accumulation of small decisions made without full information, which was how all the places that mattered were arrived at. The jungle settled around her. It was not quiet. Drummond called again on Day 97. He called to tell her that the coordination body had received a signal from the Veth, the first direct communication, transmitted simultaneously to every human communications infrastructure on the planet on a frequency that everyone could receive and no one had been using. The linguists were working on it. They thought, and this was preliminary, he said, very preliminary, they could be wrong, they thought it was a classification document. A formal catalog entry for the human species, multi-part complex. Something that had clearly taken considerable observation to compile. He asked if she had any thoughts on what classification they might have been given. She looked at the two carved objects on the shelf. She looked at the window, at the trees, at the fragment of canopy visible from where she sat. She thought about 3 months of sitting in the dirt in the dark in her pajamas, talking to something that couldn't understand her words. About animals she had no legal or biological claim to but loved anyway, in a language that was half science and half something older. Tell me what the document says, she said. I'll tell you if it sounds right. He was quiet for a moment. Then he read it to her, the translation as best the linguists could render it, the notation that the Veth had placed next to their classification of the human species in whatever archive they were building of this world. She listened. When he finished, neither of them spoke for a little while. Then Mara said, "Yes, that sounds about right." She hung up the phone. She sat in the camp chair with the broken arm. She was wearing the same faded green pajama top she'd been wearing on the first night, the one with the tear at the shoulder she'd never repaired, the one she'd worn through 3 months of sleeping in Root Hollow and talking to aliens in the dark and watching a sick infant monkey breathe herself back to health. She looked at the shelf. She looked at the two objects. She thought about what Drummond had read to her, the Veth's notation for her species, the category they'd finally built to hold human beings in all their contradiction and damage and improbable, inconvenient love. The notation, in the most approximate translation the linguists could produce, was something like, a species that remains with what it does not own in the dark without advantage, for reasons that do not optimize. Mara read it over in her mind again. She had spent her career writing field notes about other animals. This was the first time she had been the animal in someone else's notes. She thought it was, on balance, a fair assessment. She picked up her notebook. She went outside. The afternoon was cooling toward evening, and the first insects were beginning their work, and somewhere above her in the gradients of green, Katarina was moving through the canopy with Pequena clinging to her back, healthy now, strong now, the respiratory infection 3 months gone, and already a fading notation in Mara's own carefully kept records. She listened to the sound of them moving, the soft percussion of branch to branch, the comfortable rustling of animals who knew their territory, and she tilted her head back and found them in the canopy with her eyes and watched them go. They didn't look back. They rarely did. That wasn't how it worked between them. That wasn't the nature of what they had. But Katarina paused briefly on a branch high above, and her weight settled there with the particular quality of an animal at ease, an animal that knew it was in the right place, in the dark or in the light, with whatever large confusing thing was sitting below. Mara sat down in the roots of the sleeping tree, where she had been sitting for 3 months, and she opened her notebook and she wrote, Day 97, the work continues.